Welcome to episode number 3, where we're going to be checking out whether your workout nutrition plan is actually optimized for muscle and bone growth. This is also relevant for you if you don't already have a workout nutrition plan, but you want to make sure you're putting the right things in place to ensure that you're getting the results you want. I'm assuming if you are listening to this episode, you already know the benefits and the rewards we can get from prioritizing muscle and bone growth, especially as we get older as women. But if not, we're going to go over some interesting statistics that might give you a little bit more buy-in about why this is extremely important. So this is the Feminine Strength Podcast, if you didn't know already, where we are sharing innovative strategies for women to sustainably build a strong and fit body. We want to support their hormonal health and their nervous system resilience as we do this as well. I'm your host, Jess Mather. I'm a strength and rehab professional with over 14 years of experience supporting thousands of people around the world with their body, their strength, their health. So something that's really neat about social media, there's pros and cons of social media, right? But something that's really neat about social media is that we can see what's possible for us when we make certain changes in our life. So for example, on my Instagram feed, I am curating the content so that I see more women in their 50s, their 60s, 70s, even their 80s who are strong, they're functional, they're healthy. I want to see more of this content, and we're seeing more of it, that this is possible. I had shared on my social media account the other day that Dad had texted me a picture of my grandmother, or his mother, at the grocery store, and she was doing her shopping. She was standing nice and upright. She had her cart. She was just doing her thing. And Nana is 100 years old. She's actually turning 101 in a couple more months, in less than a couple months. And Nana's capabilities now, at 100 years old, are not by accident. I had shared on that post that Nana prioritized her fitness and her nutrition. When she was in her late 70s, I remember her walking laps inside of Dad's house. We used to go visit Dad in the summer in Florida, so it was too hot for her to go outside, but she still wanted to get her steps in, so she would do laps over and over again in his house. She prioritized it. She made it a habit, and she's reaping those rewards. And again, we can see that on social media. We see women 50 plus who are just killing it at the gym. They're strong, they're healthy, they're vibrant, and that's achievable for us as well. So I've also personally trained these women. I used to say that the gym that I used to work at, my now fiance's gym, we used to train a lot of grandmas. It was almost exclusively grandmas, and they were so incredibly strong. They were deadlifting over 100 pounds. They were carrying over 50 pounds in one hand. They were just incredible, and they were doing so safely. They weren't getting injured doing this either, which is really, really important. So cool things can happen when we prioritize our strength and nutrition, and it doesn't mean that we have to train 5 to 6 days a week. It doesn't even mean that we need to have a gym, okay? So we've been told this narrative, this sad tale, that we become inevitably frail and weak as we get older. And I have seen these people frail and weak. I used to work in physical therapy at nursing facilities and all sorts of different PT clinics, even in orthopedic. We would see people come in, and yes, they would come in frail or weak, but that's because they weren't actively doing anything about it. Things change when we are being really active about it and intentional, which again, I'm assuming that's why you're listening to this episode of what can we do to prevent this decline that does happen, and what are the best possible strategies to use today to counteract this aging narrative. So there are a lot of changes that happen as we age. I remember taking a continuing ed course on this several months back, and it was very bleak. And again, we'll cover some of those statistics in this episode. But we really do have so much more control over our functionality and how our body physically ages than we ever thought in the past. We have so much more evidence and experience, okay? So we see it, we have the research to back it. These are some of the things we're covering today. So currently, I'm going to assume that you're a woman in your 30s, your 40s, maybe even in your 50s or older. It's never too late to work on your strength and functionality. I have worked with patients in PT that were 100 years and older, and we were still working on their strength. We were still seeing progress. So I want to throw that out there. It is never too late to work on your strength and functionality. However, it's usually always easier to start sooner than later. So when I worked in physical therapy, one of my jobs was to restore health and function to my patients. We would call it QOL, increase quality of life in the patient. That was often in the documentation. And again, I worked at skilled nursing facilities, I worked in orthopedic clinics, home health, all sorts of different hospitals, where the objective, what I was doing with those patients of all ages, but often at least over the age of 70, was we were improving their quality of life and improving functional outcomes. Improving functional outcomes. And I saw over and over again the amazing progress that we can see of people of all ages with the right interventions. So maybe you're perhaps in your 40s or 50s and maybe you're thinking about a parent who's older. Just know that they can also benefit from this. I've had many women say, can my mom learn about this? Can my mom do this? And absolutely, it's never too late to start strength training, but it will always be easier typically to start now versus later. So what we're going to focus on today in this episode are what are the right interventions to build muscle and bone density, and how can we optimize and maximize the time we're putting in. We don't need to spend 5 to 6 days a week lifting. Sometimes that's even detrimental to us depending on our recovery. So how can we actually maximize our time? And I'm going to be sharing what I've seen work great for my patients, my former patients in physical therapy, what I see work great for my current clients, and then what we see works really great in the research as well, which I have seen in practice. So our body needs the right type of training and nutrition to build and maintain a strength long term. It's not a random process here, and we'll talk about what that is. I had mentioned also earlier on my social media page that doctors are saying the critical age to take care of your health, the critical ages rather, is between the ages of 35 to 45. So if you're in that range, this is actually one of the most optimal places to start getting your health, your fitness, and your strength in order, because as we get older, it gets a lot harder. We can still progress, but you're making it harder for yourself. So if you're in that range, we're in a really good place. So to really dial in the importance of building muscle mass and bone mass, building strength, here are a few stats that you might want to know. So this was from that continuing education course that I took several months ago. It was quite bleak, but it's good to have knowledge. So by the age of 30, by the time you turn 30, women start to lose muscle unless they strength train. We lose anywhere from 3 to 10% of muscle per decade. So if you're not doing anything to replenish, essentially to reinvest into your muscle, you're just going to lose it. That's where we see people become frail and weak, and especially once women hit perimenopause, they feel like they're just deflated balloons. They feel very weak, they feel unstable. That's not by accident. That happens naturally in that aging process, especially if they haven't been lifting. So the aging process has these key points where usually this downregulation starts to occur, where, for example, we might all notice how we don't recover as well as we did when we were younger. Children bounce back so much quicker, right? So we do start to have this decline. That's very natural. I actually was speaking to a friend of a friend. She's a physician's assistant, and she specialized in the aging process and understanding aging. Why do we age? And why are there even age-related illnesses? What causes us to age and therefore decline and be more at risk for these age-related diseases? And she was asking me these questions, and I sat and I thought for a little bit, and I said, do we age because we breathe? And I was actually correct. It was a little bit of a guess. But I was essentially thinking, well, that breathing is being alive. Being alive in general causes us to age. But she actually said, yes, that was the correct answer. We do age because we breathe. Breathing actually creates oxidative stress, which is one of the reasons why we age. There are a few other reasons why we age, but one is oxidative stress, which occurs naturally from breathing. Other factors include we age from inflammation, chronic inflammation, mitochondrial decline, telomere shortening. We did a lot of research on telomere shortening. And also hormonal changes help us to rapidly age, unfortunately, through perimenopause and menopause, as we age quite quickly during those periods of our life. So oxidative stress is really a big reason why we age, why we break down. Fortunately, strength training helps decrease oxidative stress. So I don't like to necessarily use the word anti-aging, but we can slow the aging process down as well with strength training. So a few other stats you might want to know: bone loss accelerates in postmenopause. These hormonal changes can cause up to 20% of our bone mass decreasing. So that's a significant amount of bone mass that we lose within the first 5 to 7 years postmenopause. Osteoporosis is a big deal. It affects 1 in 3 women globally, which leads to fractures and long-term disability. We do not want to have osteoporosis. We do not want to have this bone loss, which again just occurs naturally with the aging process. We have to actively do things to resist that change. So by the age of 60, muscle loss starts to speed up. So we can have sarcopenia, which is an age-related muscle loss. You might have heard that before. People over 60 are quite vulnerable to that. I saw it a lot when I worked in physical therapy. So muscle is key. Okay, building muscle is key. When we build muscle, we're often building bone mass as well, which is great. But in essence, if you want to age well, then build muscle. Keep building muscle. Keep building your strength. So studies suggest, this is a really neat study, is that studies suggest that proper weightlifting, so smart weightlifting, progressive weightlifting, can infer a 20-year advantage, meaning that if you're at the age of 80, then functionally you're really at the level of a 60-year-old. And you might have somebody in your mind that you know of who represents that. My grandma is an example of it. Nana is almost 101, and yet you could take her as a woman still in her late 70s. Somebody had mentioned in a comment on one of my posts, she knows somebody who's at the gym she volunteers at who is 93, and she thought he was in his 60s because he is strong and he's vibrant and he's healthy. So muscles, if you don't take anything away from this, muscle strength, build your strength. So more muscle also means that we are burning more calories at rest, which is really nice. So we don't have to go into these big deficits. Right? Our muscles help us with our metabolism. We're also supporting insulin sensitivity when we have more muscle on our frame. So this reduces our risk of type 2 diabetes. We want to have insulin sensitivity. You might have heard the word insulin resistance, which we don't want to have. We also, of course, with more muscle, we have more independence as we age. We're more functional. We'll have that healthier body composition, which just means more muscle and less fat on our frame. So there's less of a conversation now about just your weight, your body weight, or your BMI, and more about your body fat and muscle mass ratios. So a healthy body composition is going to be more higher muscle mass and lower body fat. So build muscle. As a side note on building muscle, this doesn't mean that you have to get bulky. This doesn't mean that you have to look like a super jacked woman. There are ways to train to put on a lot more muscle if you want to get more of that bulky look, but you don't have to. It's an important distinction too, because there's still this narrative, one, that women will get bulky when they lift, which honestly, some women can get too bulky for their liking. It's all our own preference of what we prefer our body to look like. If you're eating in a calorie surplus, meaning you're eating more calories than you burn, you will put on a little bit more fluff and you'll look more bulky. But if we're eating at maintenance or slightly below maintenance while lifting weights, you're not going to get that really bloated look or that puffy look that some women really don't want to have. It's all about individual preference. But I want to throw that out there, is building healthy muscle mass, putting healthy muscle mass on is not going to make you look bulky unless you really train to look bulky. Okay, so how do we maximize muscle and bone growth? So here's what you don't want to do. So if you're doing these things, you might want to recheck your strategy. We don't want to rely on cardio. So cardio can be great. I talk about different types of cardio in my own programs, and we can get some benefits of muscle and bone growth from some cardio sources, especially in the beginning. For example, my grandma, Nana, who was walking a lot in her late 70s and continued that throughout her life, that was still important to retain her muscle and bone growth, but it's not going to build much after. So it's still good to walk and do our cardio, but you don't want to rely on it to actually build muscle and bone growth. So the other thing that we see women do, this is so common, that isn't going to be optimal either, is to use really low weights and then doing really high reps. My client recently, I've been working with her for at least 7 years at this point. She's in her late 60s. I just saw her this morning actually, and she's great and she's strong and super fun to work with because she loves strength training. She sees the benefit of it, she's experienced the benefit of it, and she said that her friends in the similar age group just were feeling so happy that they graduated from a 2-pound dumbbell to a 3-pound dumbbell. They're pressing the weight overhead. And my client is pressing 20 pounds over her head, right? So when she heard that, of course, she was respectful about it, but that there is such this wide gap of what we feel is possible. So we want to make sure that we're not just depending on those low weight, high rep workouts where you're using a 2 or 3 pound weight and you're doing like 100 reps. It's not going to be the most optimal use of your time. So this client too, I want to mention this. She's also very functional. So she mentioned the other day with her strength. It's funny, she mentioned her friends with the 2 or 3 pound weights on this today. She said that she was having a Super Bowl party and one of their TVs went out. Well, that's not going to work for a Super Bowl party. So her and her husband went out to Costco and got a new TV, bigger TV, and those TVs are very heavy, and they had to prop it up on the wall to position it. So she wanted to make a note today. She said, you would be very proud of me, that functional strength, that she actually was able to prop that TV up. And she said for a good 30 minutes, they were trying to get it up on the hanger, essentially. And she was thinking while they were doing that, I wouldn't have been able to do this if I was just training with 2 and 3 pound weights. That she's actually functionally strong. And she bikes like a crazy woman as well. So the other thing that you don't want to do, or you might want to reevaluate, I don't like to tell people what to do, but you might want to reevaluate, is avoiding progressive overload. So technically, her friends who went from a 2 pound to a 3 pound, technically we could say, well, you were progressively loading more, but I would bet they could actually handle a lot more. So we want to make sure we're progressing in a way that actually makes sense, that we're actually getting the right stimulus that we need for the body to adapt. That's super important. We need to give the body the right amount of stimulus at the right time, at the right dose, in order for it to change, in order for it to adapt and get stronger. So sometimes what people will do when they're just kind of fluttering around with their weights, which is still maybe better than nothing, but they won't be actually tracking their progress either. They're just kind of going willy-nilly. There's no plan of progression, which doesn't allow us to see, are you actually getting stronger? Can we measure this? Measuring strength is possible. All my clients know I am all up in their business to make sure they're tracking their workouts. I've tracked my strength training for over a decade. I've been weightlifting for over 15 years. I've probably been tracking the entire time I've been lifting. I still have one journal from when I was early years in college, and a really pretty journal where I wrote down my lifts. So tracking is really important to make sure we are getting that progressive overload. The other thing that we want to make sure that we are not doing is that we're skimping on impact training. So a lot of my clients aren't doing a lot of jumping. It can be hard on their joints, but impact training, so jumping, can be a great form of training for some people to help with their bone density. We see that can be a really important factor. However, if joint pain or also weight, I've seen several of my clients where they feel really uncomfortable jumping because they feel like it's a lot of weight to move. They don't feel comfortable coming up off the ground. Then lifting can still be a really great stressor to get that adaptation in the bone as well. And then the last thing you want to make sure you evaluate to optimize your results is your muscle recovery. So I mentioned earlier, we don't just want to assume we want to train 5 to 6 days a week. My clients usually only train 3 days a week. I train 3 days a week. That's something that I can recover from. Some of my clients, they train 2 days a week, but they're recovering from it so that we can still track their progress. So if you're not prioritizing your recovery, then sometimes that can send you backwards as well. We need to have that recovery time. So here's what we want to do instead, okay? So like I mentioned, we don't have to lift all days of the week. 3 days a week is usually a really great sweet spot for most people. Most people can progress on that. They're not going to get burned out. We want to focus on progression in those sessions. We want to focus on tracking. Usually those sessions will be anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes long, and that includes rest breaks. So really, when you break down a 45 to 60-minute good progressive overload session, about half of that time is actually resting. You're resting somewhere between 1, sometimes up to 3 or 5 minutes in between sets, depending on the intensity of the lift. So progressive overload training, I've talked about this before, but it's more of an old school method. It's not very sexy. It's just progressively overloading reps, sets, intensity, so we can change the variables quite a bit. There is a lot of science behind it. I've taken several courses on programming progressive overload training, and it is extremely math and science heavy. So it's been studied and researched at length of how to do progressive overload training well, because the thing that people usually run into when they try to do progressive overload training by themselves is they usually end up pushing themselves too hard too fast. They just keep trying to add more weight on the bar week after week after week. You might be able to get away with that if you're 20. I certainly did. I was just slamming on the weight week after week, or you're pushing every session for more reps, more sets in all your lifts. That doesn't happen when we start to go into our 30s, 40s, and older. We have to be mindful of how we're programming so that we're not going to failure, so that we're not pushing 100%, even 90%, even 80% week in and week out. We need to waive the intensity. So that's a whole nother story on how to do progressive overload training well, but it's very important. So again, we want to track too, so that you're seeing how are you progressing. Can we measure things? I, of course, came from the medical field, so documentation was very, very important. You had to document everything. So my poor clients, they know I'm on them about tracking, because otherwise we can't measure as well. We want to be able to measure. We want to see, are you getting the results that you came here for? And we can do that when we track and we measure. So a lot of the movements that we do in progressive overload training are going to be what we call multi-joint movements, which you might have heard of before. Things like squats, things like rows, carrying weights around. Exercise selection and the organization of those exercises is considered that programming as well. So how we want to program the workouts out. So that's another piece of it, is making sure that you're programming the exercises themselves correctly as well. And then lastly, we want to make sure you're recovering. So usually the 3 days a week is going to be good enough for most people to recover. But again, some women I worked with and some people with autoimmune conditions, in my private practice, I work with people with complex chronic pain and chronic conditions. They might do better training 2 days a week. Some of them actually train well 5 days a week, but they're doing much shorter segments. So they're just doing a little bit each day. It all comes down to somebody's individual window of tolerance and their capacity for training, and then we play with expanding that. So it's a whole thing, but you want to make sure, are you recovering? Are you progressing? Are you tracking? So here are a few ways as well to assess whether what you're doing is working. So are you getting objectively stronger, and are you measuring it and tracking it? Can you see that things are going in the right direction? On that point, I remind my clients this: strength is not linear. So like I mentioned, if you are 20 years old and you're a beginner, your strength might be more linear. Day in and day out, you might keep increasing your strength. That is not how it goes for the bulk of your lifting career, is what we call it, when you're lifting for a long period of time. So just know your strength is not linear, but we want to generally have a trend that is going up. The other thing you want to assess about whether what you're doing is working for optimizing muscle and bone growth is that you're not always feeling beat up, you're not always feeling sore or fatigued. I say repeatedly to my clients, soreness is not an indication of a good workout. Really important. I know people like to feel sore, they like to feel like they've done something. It is not an indication that you had a good workout. It's an indication that something changed. It's an indication that we added something new that the body had to adapt to, but it doesn't mean that we're adapting in the right direction. And typically when we're sore, we usually, example this week, my Bulgarian lunges were more hard than I thought. I didn't push that much, but I might have done a little bit more range of motion. So I was quite sore. Bulgarian lunges, it's a lunge position where your back foot is elevated on a surface. And I was very sore. I was so sore that I that I did like half my workout earlier this week, right? So soreness is not actually a good thing, because usually you can't train as hard and heavy once you're ready to go again your next workout day. So please do not use soreness as an indication. The other thing is, when you're always sore, you're fatigued, you're feeling beat up. I used to train until I felt like I got hit by a truck, and I thought that was good. I thought that meant that I was pushing enough. But what happens is that becomes a distress rather than a eustress. Eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. We want a positive stressor on the body that we're able to adapt from, not a distress where we're starting to deplete ourselves and we start to break down chronically. There is a breakdown process that occurs when we're breaking down muscle fibers, and then we get stronger, but we want overall for it to be a positive stressor that we can manage. Really, really important. So we want to make sure the volume of training, the amount of work that you put in a week is appropriate for you, the intensity, the frequency, so how often you are training throughout the week is appropriate for you. We want to make sure that you're progressing in a way that makes sense. So with my clients, I'm always looking at their Google Docs is what I use right now. So I'm always tracking in their docs, all right, they're progressing at the rate that I would expect based on who they are and their age and et cetera, et cetera. So the other thing you want to look for to make sure that you're on the right track is moving your weights and reps very, very slowly. So I can't go over all the exercises of what we would expect you to progress on at what pace, and again, it depends on so many factors, but you want to make sure that you are pushing a little bit to make sure that you are moving again on that upward trend. The other problem people run into is that they are prioritizing burning calories in their fitness a lot of times. They're like, I'm just going to work out and burn calories, rather than prioritizing performance. This is a huge mindset shift for a lot of women, is that when it comes to your training, you want to make sure you are fed, you want to make sure you're getting enough carbohydrates, enough protein we'll talk about protein here in a minute, to make sure you're fueling your training. Even if you have a fat loss goal, you want to still make sure that you're building that muscle, because otherwise we'll often lose more muscle mass in that process. You don't want that. So if you're on a fat loss protocol, please focus on progressive overload training so you're not losing a bunch of muscle as you're decreasing your calories and going on a fat loss program. It's something we talk about a lot with my female clients when they're losing weight. We always look at their Google Doc to make sure that they are still progressing even as they lose weight. A little bit on nutrition here. So one of my teachers, this was profound to me. It makes sense, but just the way that she put it, she said, we don't see our best results in fitness, in our body or physique, when our nutrition doesn't match our training. When your nutrition doesn't match your training. So some people have their training really solid. They're training 3 days a week. They feel like they got a good plan, but their nutrition doesn't match that. They're not eating appropriately for the type of training. Right? We wouldn't see the same nutrition plan for somebody doing endurance type work, 6 days a week, for somebody who's lifting 3 days a week and walking the rest of the time. Their nutrition would be different because their goals are different and their training is different. So we want to match our nutrition to our training and our outcomes. With protein needs, the internet has exploded more recently about protein needs. Everything has protein in it now. But for our protein needs, we want to get at least a minimum. Science is saying, research is saying, some people do better, less or more, just throwing this out there, but in general, minimum is about 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight, at least to maintain where we're at. For an optimal range for growth, for growing more muscle, can be closer to 1 gram to 1.2 grams per pound of body weight. So for an example, a 150-pound woman would want somewhere between 120 to 150 grams per day. It doesn't have to be perfect every single day. It's not going to be, right on every single day, but generally that range is going to be optimal for, say, a 150-pound woman. So a few signs you're not eating enough protein. One, if you just track it, that you can use Fat Secret or MyFitnessPal. Chronometer, I think, is another one I've seen my clients use. So you can just track your protein and look at that. If you don't want a calorie count for whatever reason, you don't want to look at your numbers, some signs that you're not eating enough protein can be that you have more brittle nails, you're losing your hair, slower healing. Obviously, this can happen because of other reasons, but constant hunger and sugar cravings is a big one. protein really, really helps with sugar cravings. If you're getting slow recovery or constant soreness, if your volume in your training is all nice and it actually works for your body, but you're still recovering very slowly, it could be because you're not eating enough protein. I have found that women that come in and they're not tracking their protein, they're not paying attention to it, they'll usually only be eating about half their grams in body weight or less. So make sure you check. If you're comfortable tracking in a calorie counter, I would just do a little thing, just put in what you're eating and see. So a little thing on macros in general as well, which are your carbs, your fat, your protein, and also your alcohol. Low carb is not generally going to be your best bet when it comes to building muscle. We want to get in a little bit more carbohydrate, especially to help support our hormones and our thyroid. So we want to make sure that you're eating some carbs. I never put my female clients on a keto diet. Some of them choose to for therapeutic purposes, for short term, but I never recommend it in terms of just the general population. We also need to make sure we're getting enough fat for hormonal production. Really, really important that you're not in this chronic low fat or low calorie state. So for low in anything, that's not a good thing. We need adequate carbs, protein, fat, and calories. We talk about that a lot in our feminine strength program because nutrition is a big one. We've been taught to always eat less carbs. Carbs are the devil, and it's just, that's not the case. I want to sneak in here as well. I didn't mention at the beginning of this episode, but every episode I drop in a secret word. And if you collect 8 of these secret words, we give you 10% off our feminine strength training program, training and nutrition program. So collect these secret words. The secret word in this episode is lettuce, like the food, like the salad food, lettuce. So nutrients for bone growth as well that we want are going to be calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, even collagen and vitamin C. So there are different mineral hair tests you can take that you can test your minerals just to make sure that you are optimizing your bone health. Recovery is really important as well. Again, if we want to build muscle and bone density, we need to make sure we're recovering. We're giving our body time to actually grow and build. As they say, we don't build muscle in the gym, we build it when we're sleeping. So we need sleep and recovery. I have seen all over the socials how people are saying now, there's studies that say women need 10 hours of sleep or more. We need significantly more than men. And I don't know, I haven't found any conclusive evidence. I tried to look at the research and nothing was really conclusive, but I don't care. I prefer lots of sleep. So if you are also somebody who wants a lot of sleep, I think that's fantastic. When I set my alarm for the next morning and it says, it'll pop up on my little screen, it'll say your alarm is set for X amount of hours from now. And when it says 10 hours from now, I am a happy girl. That means I got into bed at the right time. That doesn't mean I just fall asleep. Sometimes I'll be reading or something, but when my alarm says, we won't put your alarm up for another 10 hours, I say, oh, how luxurious, right? So get your sleep. It's very, very important. That high cortisol that can happen from poor sleep, might have gone through a phase in your life where that's happened, that can actually break down muscle and it can increase body fat accumulation. So sleep is very, very important when it comes to recovery and a good body composition. I talk about that a lot with my clients as well. They know I'm all up in their business about their sleep. So, are you optimizing your muscle and bone growth? We're already going a little over my 30 minutes. I said, these episodes will all be 30 minutes. I'll get it in, but there's a lot of stuff here to cover. So, again, your actions matter. Your behaviors matter. They make a big difference. They make a big difference whether you're 20, 30, 40. You're creating the habits that are going to sustain you for life. That's the most important. You have a lot of control over how you age, how you perform, how you look. We can use these more evidence-based strategies in a way that really works. So I'm going to go in a little bit about feminine strength. I mentioned it a little here if you use our secret word, right? So feminine strength is where we give you the exact framework to make sure that you're building your muscle, you're building that bone density, and you're gaining skills to lift for life. That's why we talk about it being a sustainable model. So feminine strength is a personalized, so customized to you, progressive overload training using body weights and bands the first month, and then we go into kettlebells, and it's 3 days a week. just 45 to 60 minutes, 3 days a week. We modify that sometimes as well. Again, some clients prefer a little bit less. They recover better with 2 days a week, and we can make that work. So the ability to be flexible in our training, we can adapt it for wherever we are in life, wherever our body is at in life, is so, so important. That's a sustainable piece. Usually people are on or off with their training. No, it does not have to be that way. It really, really does not. We can still progress. We just have to be able to modify the training and know what changes we need to make to move forward. So in the training, we also talk about something called parasympathetic cardio. So we mentioned cardio earlier, is that it's important, although it's not the best strategy for necessarily building muscle, but it can help with our body recomposition, which means that we are building that muscle and losing fat. We also have a whole body recomposition protocol in Fem Strength that the clients follow. That's really, really simple and straightforward to follow, and also adaptable depending on the person. So the parasympathetic cardio we want to do is not depleting for our body. A lot of cardio can also raise those cortisol levels. It can help us recover less in terms of our training, that if we're always doing our cardio, then how are we even going to recover from our training or weightlifting? We usually can't. Again, we can get away with it maybe in our 20s, maybe in most of our 30s, but then it starts to become increasingly hard. Our body is going through the aging process. We need more recovery time. So in Fem Strength, we have that accountability piece that, again, I say I spy on my clients. I go into their Google Docs and I'm looking at what they're tracking. We do one-on-one calls to make sure that your form is really good. Again, my background's in physical therapy. I specialize in complex chronic pains and injuries. So the form is so important, and we go into that in more depth in the videos as well. I've gotten great feedback on the videos in Feminine Strength, where they're like, wow, I've never learned how to do this exercise properly, this squat properly, even though I thought I was doing this well. There are so many key nuances to moving well so that you don't get injured. Injury prevention is huge, huge, huge. You know, as my background in rehab, I'm not doing my job if I injure one of my clients. So we have classes also on nutrition for hormonal health to make sure we're optimizing your metabolism. We have trainings on how to sync your training to your cycle so that we're waiving that intensity in line with how your cycle is, depending on when you feel the most crappy. We actually do less on that week, but we're still progressing, and we know you are because we're tracking it. And then we have some bonus resources as well. Some women want to be able to do their first push-up. Well, we give you a program where you can do your first push-up and your first 10 push-ups on the ground, not girl push-ups on your knees. It just means that we are doing a clear program. We're having clear progression. You can get there. Anybody can get there. We also have some classes on how to modify your training for travel. A lot of women come in and they're traveling. They're going all over the place. How do we modify your training for that? So you can visit the website rebuildingbody.com/feminine strength for more information on that. Rebuildingbody.com/feminine strength. There's a lot more information about the program, and you can reach out for a consultation or with questions. But 3 things to remember as we close up this podcast episode. Muscle and bone loss is preventable. Okay, we can prevent our muscles and bones from depleting at such a rapid rate, but you need to be able to be training and eating properly to do that. Progressive overload is essential so that we are making sure that the body is adapting to new stressors that we're putting on it. You have to get stronger over time. And then lastly is make sure you're fueling your body properly. You're not constantly in a calorie deficit or a carbohydrate deficit, making sure you're eating enough protein. That's going to be so key. Okay. So again, if you want to learn more about Fem Strength, you can go to rebuildingbody.com/feminine strength and get more information. Other than that, this was a great episode. I hope you learned some new things and you're inspired to grab a kettlebell, get stronger, and build your vitality for life. All right, talk to you guys soon.